Hello, and welcome to another video podcast. Applying Smarter, how to move beyond Apply Smart and improve residency application for everyone. I'll be your host, Brian Carmody, and over this podcast, we're going to closely examine the Association of American Medical Colleges Apply Smart informational campaign. We're going to highlight the sources of bias contained therein. And we're going to identify some ways that the AAMC, if they were so inclined, could provide more useful information to applicants in deciding to which residency programs they should apply. But before we get into all that, first, a prologue. We need to frame this discussion with the current state of residency application in the year 2019. Because unless you're a medical student or a program director or a very recent graduate, you probably aren't in touch with the current state of affairs. I'll be honest, I wasn't until I got interested in this topic sometime last year. And so if it's been a while since you've applied to residency or since you've looked at residency application statistics, this is what you've been missing out on. Shown on the graphic here is the trend in the mean number of applications submitted per applicant using the electronic residency application service from the years 2007 to 2018. As you can see, 10 years ago, U.S. medical graduates applied to a little over 30 programs apiece. That has now doubled to 60 programs apiece. International medical graduates are now submitting almost 140 applications on average. It's a ridiculous state of affairs that really benefits almost no one. Program directors get buried under an avalanche of applications each season. They're forced to use convenience metrics like USMLE Step 1 scores that really correlate very poorly with the traits and the outcomes that they most want to assess or predict. Applicants pay more and more money to apply to more and more programs for really no increased benefit. Because here's the funny thing. Along with this rising tide of applications, match rates are essentially unchanged. In other words, you could go back 10 years, 15 years, when people were applying to fewer programs, and the match rates are the same. The same number of candidates are finding programs, the same number of programs are finding applicants. So if that's the case, why can't we just turn back the clock? Why can't we just go back in time, everybody agree to apply to a smaller number of programs, and program directors won't be as burdened, applicants won't have a little bit of extra money in their pocket, and everybody will have the same outcome? It's an interesting question, and one that I analyzed extensively in my last podcast, Application Fever. If you missed that, you may want to go back and take a listen before you continue on with this. But for now, let's take that question at face value. Why can't we just apply to fewer programs and enjoy the same outcome? Maybe all that applicants need is more information. They need some data to show them that they don't need to apply to so many programs. And if they had this, they'd stop over-applying in a way that's hurting everyone. And if applicants need better information, who's in a better position to provide that information than the AAMC, sponsor of ARIS? And so it was upon this background that the AAMC in 2016 unveiled their Apply Smart campaign, a series of data analyses and graphics that are ostensibly to help medical students decide how many programs they should really apply to. According to the AAMC, your likelihood of securing residency training depends on many factors, including the number of residency programs you apply to. Continuing on from the AAMC website, does submitting one more application always help? Our researchers suspected that, unlike buying raffle tickets, where the more tickets you buy, the better your chances of winning, additional applications to residency does not necessarily increase your chances of getting accepted to a program. We set out to determine if there was a point where the relationship between the number of applications submitted and the likelihood of entry into residency changes, or simply put, a point of diminishing returns. And this, of course, this is a very appealing and powerful logic. If it is the case that there's a point of diminishing returns, that there's a point at which submitting more applications doesn't further enhance your probability of entering a residency program, well then why would people apply beyond that? So the AAMC considers on, as you consider the number of residency programs you apply to, consider the strength of your entire application as well as your personal circumstances. But also note, Though it varies by specialty, Step 1 scores, and applicant type, there is a point at which submitting one or more applications results in a lower rate of return on entering a residency program. So this is the reason for being for the Apply Smart campaign. And in the rest of this podcast, we're going to take a critical look at the Apply Smart data and analyses and decide if this information is really going to be useful to students, or if it's so horribly biased that it provides little in the way of useful information. And at best, it will do nothing to curtail application fever or lead to better application strategies. And at worst, it will actually systematically encourage students to further over-apply. So with that background, we begin. Chapter 1, Dissecting Apply Smart. Let's take a close look at the Apply Smart graphics. First, let's get oriented. What I'm showing you here is a graphic from emergency medicine residency applicants. You'll see that the x-axis of the graph is the number of applications submitted. Pretty straightforward. That's the variable that we're really interested in. On the y-axis, we have the probability of entering a residency program. And importantly, this is the true probability of entering a residency program. This is not the match rate. If you got into a residency program either through the match or the SOAP, you are counted as having been successful. So again, that seems like the outcome that we really are interested in. So far, so good, right? Now you'll see that there's 3 curves that appear on the graphic. And those curves begin showing a low probability of entering a residency program when the number of applications submitted is low, and a higher probability of entering a residency program as those applications increase. But you'll note here that the curves sort of flatten off after a certain point, and that's what we identify as the point of diminishing returns. Now, again, I show here emergency medicine residency programs, but the curves are similar. Here are other graphics for anesthesiology, diagnostic radiology, family medicine, general surgery, OBGYN, pediatrics, and you'll see that in each of these graphics, the curves take a similar form. There are 3 curves on each graphic because each curve corresponds to a tertile of students grouped by USMLE Step 1 scores. So on each graphic, you'll see the yellow curve corresponds to students who are in the highest third of USMLE Step 1 scores for that specialty. So you can see for anesthesiology, that means folks who had a 237 or higher. The purple curve is the bottom third of USMLE Step 1 scores. So you can see, for example, in anesthesiology, that corresponds to folks who have a Step 1 score of less than 220. Let's zoom back in on the emergency medicine graphic so that we can look closer at this point of diminishing returns. You'll see that the AAMC has it labeled for us on each of the graphics. The point of diminishing returns is calculated mathematically using spline regression. So it's a change in the inflection in the curve. There's one relationship between the x and y variables on this side of that knot, and there's a different relationship on this point. And as you can see, things get kind of flat beyond this point of diminishing returns. In other words, putting it all together, what we're supposed to take from this graphic is, let's say that you're an applicant who's in the bottom third of USMLE Step 1 scores for emergency medicine. Well, your point of diminishing returns is at 32 applications, meaning you can apply to 50, 70, 100 programs if you want, but your probability of entering a residency program does not increase beyond what it was for an applicant who applied to 32 programs. Similarly, if you're in the top third of USMLE Step 1 scores, you could apply to 23 programs and you similarly have reached your point of diminishing returns. That's the takeaway that we're supposed to take from these graphics. In fact, there are several papers published now written by program directors in general surgery or pediatrics where using the Apply Smart graphics is encouraged when you're counseling medical students about how many programs they should apply to. So what's wrong with any of this? I mean, this seems like the very kind of information that medical students crave, that faculty advisors would want to counsel students. Where's the catch? And with that, we come to Chapter 2, Upon Closer Inspection. And you'll see that for the section header of this chapter, I have an old cartoon by American cartoonist William Eli Hill. And this cartoon was published in 1915 with the caption, "My wife and my mother-in-law are both in this picture. find them. Because once I started looking at these Apply Smart graphics, I started to see them in a different way. And once I saw them in that way, I couldn't unsee them. Every time I look at them now, I see the bias. So what we're going to do in this chapter is we're going to go through the problems with the Apply Smart graphics, analyses, and their presentation. We're going to cover 4 separate areas, and I think that after I've highlighted these problems to you, you're only going to be able to see the mother-in-law too. Problem number 1, perpetuation of misinformation. Now, this problem doesn't relate specifically to the Apply Smart graphics or the data analysis that underlies them. Instead, it relates to the way that the Apply Smart campaign is described to medical students, and it's something that pushes one of my buttons. But since this is my podcast, you're going to get to hear about one of my buttons being pushed. And it got pushed when I watched this official AAMC video for the Apply Smart to Residency campaign. You can find this video on YouTube if you like. It's not a bad video. It has a lot more production value than the video you're watching right now. But it includes this one section where we have our main character, this medical student, who's looking at this graphic of a rising number of medical school graduates, and the voiceover says, "You've probably heard that residency slots aren't growing at the same rate as graduating medical students, so an already complex and competitive situation has become, well, even more complex and competitive." And this right here, the idea that residency spots are not growing at the same rate as graduating medical students, is something that I hear all the time. And it's something that's used to justify all kinds of bad logic. Like, for example, the fact that medical students have to apply to more and more programs because it's just more competitive. There's more and more people competing for fewer and fewer spots. And it has an appealing logic, but it's not true. What is true? Well, let's take a look at some real data so that we can separate fact from fiction. What I'm showing you here is Figure 1 from the NRMP Results and Data 2019 Main Residency Match Report. This is a graph that shows the total number of match applicants from 1952 to 2019. That's represented by this teal graphic right here. And then this purple graphic shows the available of PGY1 positions in the match. Now, what is true is that there are more match applicants than there are positions available. And as you can see, that has been the case since the 1980s. We've had more applicants than there are spots. But the disparity between those two things is not widening, and it hasn't been for a while. As you can see, the difference between these curves has been pretty stable for the past 10 or 15 years. It is therefore a poor explanation of application fever that the residency marketplace is somehow tightening up. In fact, as you can see, while this curve has been advancing at a stable rate, the number of applicants, there's actually been an upswing in the number of available positions in the last couple of years. An easier way to look at this is to look at the number of positions in the match available for every applicant. And the NRMP does that for us too. So here's Figure 3. What you'll see is that the teal curve on this graphic represents the number of positions per every applicant. So if we had a perfect marketplace where we had exactly the number of positions as we have applicants, that ratio would be 1. That would be the red line right here. And as you can see, for 20 plus years, the ratio has been below 1. It was 0.86 in last year's match. But take a look at that curve. That's pretty flat. In fact, it's trending back up toward 1. The 0.86 positions per match applicant was one of the more favorable ratios in the past few years. And for U.S. seniors, for fourth-year U.S. medical students from allopathic medical schools, it's an even better marketplace. There were 1.7 residency positions for every 1 U.S. senior medical student. That is the highest rate that we've seen in 40 years. Let me say that again. There has never been a more favorable time in my entire life to be a graduating U.S. medical student as there is now. There's more positions available to you now relatively than there have ever been. Now listen, I bring this up not to diminish the struggle that students face in getting the residency position that they want. Especially students from osteopathic schools or international medical graduates may face a real uphill battle in getting the residency positions that they want, because just because we have all these positions, it doesn't mean they're in the specialties or in the locations that people prefer. So I highlight this not to diminish the struggle here, but to say that the idea that we have this growing disparity between people who want matched positions and matched positions, it's not true. And if I know it's untrue, then why does the AAMC not know that it's untrue? Why is the AAMC using this logic to present the Apply Smart graphics to students? To me, it seems like fear-mongering. I mean, listen, nobody thinks that getting a residency spot is going to be a cakewalk, but let's have a real discussion about it. There's no reason to bandy about this kind of false logic just because it makes things easier. Let's have a real discussion about this, because it's a real issue that we all have a stake in. And if you're wondering, why is it the case that students are applying to so many programs when the market is not tightening up, then I would refer you to my website or the Application Fever podcast, where that question is specifically addressed. But here we're talking about Apply Smart, so I'm going to move on to problem number 2. Correlation does not equal causation. We hear this all the time in medicine when we're talking about observational data, and the AAMC's Apply Smart data are observational. The AAMC did not run some kind of secret randomized controlled trial where medical students were randomized to apply to a certain number of programs, and then their outcome was compared to students who were randomized to apply to a different number of programs. No, that's not how we got these. Observational data can tell you that an association exists between two factors, but it can't tell you that one of those factors causes the other. There are examples of this all over the place, but a funny example just happened to roll across my Twitter feed right before I started recording this podcast. Someone did a study where they found that people who owned dogs lived longer than people who didn't. And this was observational data. Nobody showed up at your house and, gave you a dog if you'd been randomized to the dog arm, or a sham dog if you hadn't. It was just, some people had dogs, some people didn't. People who had dogs, they lived longer. And there's nothing wrong with that as far as it goes. The problem comes when some journalists pick up this study and run with it and write about it in such a way that suggests that if you go out and buy a dog, that you'll live longer. And, you should go out and get a dog because people with dogs live longer. So therefore, if you buy a dog, you'll live longer too. And obviously that's not the case. People choose to own a dog or they choose to not own a dog. And there's lots of reasons why they might choose one way or another, but those reasons are also tied up with their health outcome. One reason you might not want to own a dog is maybe because you're physically debilitated and you just simply can't care for an energetic animal. And all things considered, someone like that is probably more likely to die than someone who does have the capability of taking care of a dog, whether they choose to take care of a dog or not. Whether you have a dog or you don't, there are reasons for it. And whether you choose to apply to 5 residency programs or 50 or 150, there are reasons for that too. So when we look at some of the Apply Smart graphics, you'll see there's something funny that emerges. Take a look at this one for anesthesiology. What I want you to focus on here is this yellow line. So this is the group of applicants who have the highest USMLE Step 1 scores. All of these are in the highest third of all anesthesiology applicants with scores of 237 or higher. And you'll notice that this group of applicants reaches their point of diminishing returns around 18 applications. But notice the shape of this curve. It doesn't go perfectly flat. It actually has a downward deflection as you move farther out. Now, does that mean that this guy who applied to 35 programs, he would have had a better outcome had he only applied to, 20? Of course not. A more likely explanation is that the type of candidate who applies to a lot of programs is different than the type of candidate who applies to only a few. Those two candidates are likely to differ in lots of ways that impact their competitiveness for residency. Maybe one has poor grades or weaker letters of recommendation, or knows that they don't interview well, and that's why they apply to lots of programs. Applicants do not apply to a certain number of programs at random. They have reasons for it. And so we simply cannot conclude that the group of applicants who apply to 25 programs or 35 programs in anesthesiology would have had a worse outcome had they only applied to 15. We simply cannot conclude that on the basis of these data, and that's even if these data were unbiased and presented accurate probabilities. But with that, it's time to look at how accurate those probabilities really are. Now we're getting into some of the bigger problems with Apply Smart. Problem number 3, bias. And what I hope to show you here is that the way that the AAMC calculates their probabilities is simply not accurate. To show you why, let's use as an example my field, pediatrics. So students who apply to pediatric residency programs don't apply to nearly as many as in some disciplines like orthopedics or dermatology or even OBGYN lately. But still, in 2019, the average applicant from a U.S. medical school applied to 36 programs, which is double what it was just 10 years ago, so paralleling the national statistics. That increase in applications per student has occurred even as the popularity of pediatrics has declined among graduating U.S. medical students. You know, there are fewer people now who are applying to pediatrics residency from U.S. medical schools than there were 5 years ago. If you look at last year's match statistics, you'll see there were over 2,800 intern-level positions offered in pediatrics, and there were only 1,900 U.S. medical graduates who sought those positions. For better or worse, American medical students are not falling all over each other trying to get into pediatrics. And what that means is there's a lot of good pediatric residency programs out there, there's a lot of good applicants, and a qualified applicant from a U.S. medical school should really not have any trouble matching in pediatrics. And that's what I tell students who come to me seeking advice from our own medical school. So I was a little bit surprised when I looked at the AAMC's Apply Smart graphic for pediatrics. I wasn't surprised by the point of diminishing returns. I mean, 13 or 15 applications seems like more than enough for a qualified student to match. But when you look at it closely, what is going on over here? According to the AAMC, if you apply to only 5 pediatric programs, you have only a 40% chance of entering a residency program in pediatrics. Does that strike you as being a little bit curious? I mean, who are these students with step scores over 235 who are applying to only 5 programs and accepting only a 40% chance that they're going to have a residency program to enter the following year? And of course, it's not just pediatrics. Go back and look at all the Apply Smart graphics that I showed you before. They all have the same form in every specialty. There are apparently these students who just don't know, I guess, that 10 ARIS applications cost the exact same as one and are apparently applying to a low number of programs and accepting a 20 to 40% chance of matching into that discipline. Who are these people? I'll tell you who. They're people who don't really care if they match in pediatrics or not. These are applicants who are applying to pediatrics as a backup specialty. What I'm showing you now are the ARIS cross-specialty applicant data. And so you can see in this matrix, we have all the specialties listed down and across. And it shows the combination of people who applied, for example, in both pediatrics and general surgery, of which there were 899 in the year 2018. Now maybe they're just really 899 students who are just completely torn between a career as a general surgeon or a career as a pediatrician. Or, more likely, these are people who maybe they want to be a surgeon, but more than that, they want to be able to practice as a physician. And so in addition to applying to general surgery programs, which can be more competitive, they apply to a couple of pediatrics programs as a backup. What's striking to me about this table is that there are no zeros on it. Every cell has a number. Every combination of medical specialties that you can think of, there was at least one applicant who applied in both of those fields. So we had 204 people applying in both diagnostic radiology and dermatology. We had 113 people applying in emergency medicine and otolaryngology. And listen, don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with applying in multiple fields. I mean, especially if you're applying in a competitive specialty. I'm not criticizing the applicants for doing this, but when the AAMC fails to separate out the data, these backup applications have the effect of biasing the Apply Smart graphics. Because importantly, all the Apply Smart analyses are specialty specific. What that means is, on the pediatrics graph, unless you found a residency program in pediatrics, you count as not having entered a residency program. Even if you happily pursued your career in anesthesia or general surgery or dermatology or some other field, and you only applied to 5 pediatric programs just in case that fell through, you're counted as an applicant who failed to enter a residency program in pediatrics. If you think about the mathematical effect on the analyses of leaving in these candidates who are applying to backup specialties, it should become clear that for every specialty, there's a cluster of applicants in the lower left quadrant of that graph who apply to a low number of programs, likely as a backup, and have a low probability of matching in that field, but that's because most people get their preferred specialty. But that cluster of points drags down the regression analysis. And remember, that point of diminishing returns is calculated at the point where the slope changes. It's the spline knot. So leaving that cluster of points in there has the effect of biasing each one of the Apply Smart analyses. But that's not the only way that failing to exclude backup applications biases the analyses. So let's move on to problem number 4 and highlight more bias. This is the Apply Smart graphic for diagnostic radiology. Let's suppose that I'm an average applicant in diagnostic radiology. I've got a step 1 score of somewhere between 230 and 244, which puts me on this gray curve. And I look at this gray curve and I see that according to the AAMC, I reach my point of diminishing returns at 23 applications, meaning that I can apply to more programs if I want, but my probability of entering a residency program will not increase beyond that point. All right, well, that's cool. Maybe I'll apply to 23 programs. So what is my likelihood of success according to the AAMC? Let's go track back across on this dashed line. Whoa, it's only like 65%. So you're telling me that the best I can do in diagnostic radiology as a US graduate with average step 1 scores for diagnostic radiology is a 65% chance of success? I mean, I knew radiology was competitive, but is it that competitive? No, it's not. According to the NRMP, 89% of US seniors who wanted to match in radiology successfully matched in radiology last year. Why is there such a difference? It's because the NRMP calculates the match rate based on an applicant's preferred specialty, which they define as the specialty type that you listed for your number 1 program on your rank list. So if you list a diagnostic radiology program number 1, you get counted as somebody who prefers radiology, and that 89% statistic applies to you. The AAMC's 65% statistic counts that applicant exactly the same as a guy who applies to a handful of radiology programs and doesn't even interview at them because he interviews at 30 orthopedics programs. The bottom line is that the Apply Smart probability of entering a residency program ends up being significantly less than the NRMP's match rate for every specialty. That's what I'm showing you here. The red bars represent Apply Smart. The blue bars are the NRMP's match rate. And you can see for some specialties, the difference is striking. For plastic surgery or vascular surgery, the actual match rate is twice what the AAMC's graphics would suggest. So what's the effect of all this biased data on student behavior? If the AAMC has any data on this, I don't think they've released it. So I performed my own very unscientific inquiry. A few days ago, I was sitting in clinic with a student who was interested in a career in anesthesiology. She was rotating with me in the nephrology clinic. We had a few minutes of downtime, so I showed her the anesthesiology Apply Smart graphic, which is shown here. And I asked her to interpret it. Now, she was a very good applicant with step 1 scores that would be in the top tertile for all anesthesiology applicants. And her advisor had recommended applying to about 30 or 35 programs, which would be in line with the national average. So I showed her this graphic, And she looked at it and said, well, I guess according to this, I should only apply to 18 or so programs because beyond that, I've hit my point of diminishing returns. And I said, yeah, that's right. What do you think about the y-intercept at that point? And I highlighted this over here, which would signify about a 70% chance of matching in anesthesiology. And at that point, her face clouded. And I said, so how many programs do you think you're going to apply to? And she said, 30 or 35. But if you'll humor me, I'd like to move on beyond this N of one anecdote and try to predict how Apply Smart might be likely to impact applications broadly. So for Chapter 3, let's talk about effects of Apply Smart. Back when I first started to point out some of these sources of bias, I had an interesting exchange with someone on Twitter. This person pointed out that for almost every specialty, the AAMC's point of diminishing returns is lower, often significantly lower, than the average number of applications currently being submitted. And this person said, hey, why are you complaining about the AAMC? They're the good guys. You know, if people follow these point of diminishing returns, even if the data are biased, people will still submit fewer applications. What are you complaining about? So for the moment, let's just ignore the premise of this, that it's a good thing to give misleading data to medical students as long as the end serves something that is a good thing, we think. And let's get at the meat of the argument, which is that the Apply Smart graphics should result in students applying to fewer applications because the current mean number of applications being submitted is higher than the point of diminishing returns. Let's take, for example, internal medicine. Here is the Apply Smart graphic for internal medicine. Now in 2018, the average number of applications submitted by U.S. medical graduates applying in internal medicine was 40. And as you can see here, the point of diminishing returns is reached well before that, depending on the applicant's USMLE Step 1 score. For candidates with the highest Step 1 scores, the point of diminishing returns is reached at 15 applications. Even among those with the lowest Step 1 scores, still only 30 applications gets you there. So should we then expect that all the people who are applying over here, they're applying to 40 programs, are now going to apply at their diminishing returns? It's possible that some applicants will do just that. They will see the AAMC's data, they will see this point, they will take full faith in it, and they will apply to fewer programs because the AAMC said that they could. But I think it's also safe to assume that there are applicants who will not be so swayed by the AAMC's inflection points here. And they'll say, well, you know, maybe the average person who has a Step 1 score in the upper tertile applies to 15 programs, but am I really average? I mean, I don't know. Maybe I didn't honor in my internal medicine clerkship. You know, maybe I don't have as many extracurriculars as I perceive other people do. Maybe I need to apply to 15 and a little bit more because, you know, if you cut it too close, you're going to be on this precipitous drop, this downslope over here, and nobody wants to be in that, especially given the high stakes of not matching. So I think it's debatable about whether an applicant who is applying to more programs than the point of diminishing returns, whether that applicant will be inspired to apply to fewer on the basis of these data. If you're on the flat of the curve, I don't know. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But what's not debatable is how to interpret this data if you are an applicant who is planning to apply to fewer programs than the point of diminishing returns. Because if you're on this side of the graph, the interpretation is unambiguous. You need to apply to more programs or you are going to face a very poor probability of entering a residency program. Therefore, I think that this informational campaign will be far more motivating to people who are applying to a low number of programs than it will be in motivating people who are already applying to a large number of programs. But just for the sake of argument, let's say that every single person who applied above the point of diminishing returns was inspired by this analysis. And they said, you know what, that's silly. I'm not wasting my money. I'm going to apply exactly at the point of diminishing returns and no more. And let's say that, hypothetically, at the same time, every single candidate who was applying to fewer programs than their point of diminishing returns said, well, you know what? I don't want to have this low probability of entering a residency program, and certainly not. I'm going to apply at my point of diminishing returns, but no more because I realize that that would be throwing my money away. What would happen if both groups changed their behavior in such a way? Well, if you had an equal number of people who were applying above the point of diminishing returns and who were applying below, it would be a wash, right? But is that really the case? Are there really equally as many people who apply above the point of diminishing returns as who apply below it? Because, what's missing here is what the distribution of applicants look like. How many people are submitting 5 applications, 10, 15, 20? The AAMC does not provide those data, even though they are in possession of them. But if we look to some other sources, we can get a sense of what the distribution may look like. And when we do, we discover that the distribution of applications submitted is not a normal distribution. This graphic here comes from a paper that was published in the American Journal of Medicine in 2018. The data contained here were taken from a survey of internal medicine residents. There are 3 different bars on the chart. The yellow corresponds to third-year residents, the blue to second-year residents, and the green to interns. So as you can see, there's a slightly different distribution by class year, with the interns having applied to more programs than the third-year residents, for example. However, there is no way that you would mistake any of these distributions for a normal distribution. The bulk of the data is here in the low range. As you can see, for the third-year residents, over 35% applied to fewer than 15 programs. However, there is a long tail on this distribution, with a relatively small number of residents who applied to over 75 programs. However, that group has a disproportionate impact when you calculate the mean number of applications submitted. For rightward skewed data like this, the mean will overstate the real central tendency of the data. A median might be a better way of looking at this, but we aren't given that by the AAMC. Or at least we don't get the median for internal medicine. However, I did find a paper that listed the median number of applications submitted by applicants applying in general surgery. Now, in 2018, the average number of applications submitted by a U.S. senior who was applying in general surgery was 56. So, what do you think you're going to see when I show you the median number of applications submitted? If we had a normal distribution, the mean and the median will be the same. However, if we have a right-tailed distribution, the median will be substantially less than what the mean is. And there you have it. For USMDs, the median number of applications is almost half of what the mean is. In other words, half of all U.S. seniors who are applying to categorical general surgery programs are applying to 26 or fewer programs. The mean is so high because there is a relatively small number of applicants who are applying to an obscene number of programs. The average applicant is truly applying to far fewer. So how is Apply Smart going to impact the average applicant? So let's take a look at the graphic for general surgery. And as you can see, for applicants with the highest USMLE Step 1 scores, the point of diminishing returns is listed as 36. Remember, the median is down here, so 50% of all applicants are having an apparent probability of matching that's somewhere between 20 and 50% or so. What do you think those people are going to do? They're going to apply to more programs if they're influenced by this data at all. It is for this reason that I am very skeptical that the Apply Smart analyses and graphics are going to result in any decrease in the number of applications that program directors receive. Even if all applicants look at the graphics and adjust their application strategy accordingly, there are more applicants who apply below their point of diminishing returns than there are going to be who apply above it. Now, at this point, I could continue and point out that it's somewhat curious that the AAMC is in possession of the data distribution of the number of applications that students really submit, but they choose to reduce it down to a mean, which overstates what's truly normal. And I might further go on and point out that the AAMC is the sponsor of the Electronic Residency Application Service, ERAS, and that this has become a remarkable cash cow for the organization, as I highlighted in my previous podcast. And if I were to continue in this logical progression, I might ask that you consider whether the AAMC has a financial conflict of interest in the data that it chooses to show us and the data that it chooses to withhold. But for now, I'm going to leave all that to you, and I'm going to move on to Chapter 4, How to Help Students Apply Smarter. And at this point, I hope I've been successful in convincing you that even if we look at them in the most favorable light possible, the AAMC's apply smart analyses are horribly biased, and they provide little in the way of useful information to students who are trying to determine how many programs they should apply to. Because beyond the biased data, there's a bigger problem with Apply Smart. The analyses seem to assume that the primary variable that determines whether you're going to get into a residency program or not is the number of programs that you apply to. And that's just simply not the case. Suppose, for example, that I have two high school seniors. They are completely equal as applicants in every way. One applies to 20 colleges. One applies to 2 colleges. Who has the higher chance of getting into college next year? Anybody want to answer that question? Or would you say, I need more information? Because that's what I would say. I would say we need to know something about the nature of the schools to which she applied, not just the number. Because if applicant number 1 applies to Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, University of Chicago, Duke, MIT, Northwestern, Caltech, Naval Academy, etc., all of those are very selective schools. All of those are schools that could conceivably reject someone unless they are just an outstanding applicant. On the other hand, if the person who applies to 2 colleges applies to Harvard and their state university, which of these 2 applicants now do you think has a higher chance of going to college next year? Clearly, it's the second one, even though this person only applied to 2 colleges. So by just considering the number of applications that you submit, we really are missing the boat. We have to consider both the nature of those programs and we have to consider the nature of the applicant. I like to use this college example for a couple of reasons. One is that it's very accessible. All medical students have gone to college. They know what the college application process was like, so it's very intuitive. But also it begs a good question that I think is very relative to residency applications as well, and that is, why don't we see more talented high schoolers getting shut out of college? Why don't we see people going unmatched for their college applications? And there's a few reasons for that. I mean, there's a lot of colleges for one thing, but number 2, high schoolers who are applying to colleges have at their fingertips a wealth of information to help them decide where are they competitive, where are they likely to get in. And it's easy to devise a strategy where you have some reach schools, and some safety schools. And with that, you can apply to a smaller number of places if you wanted to, and end up with a high degree of certainty that you'll be able to go to college next year. Now look, I'm not trying to say that there's a perfect analogy between college admissions and residency. There's not. But I want you to consider the role that information plays. Because when high schoolers are applying to colleges, they can turn to a lot of high-quality resources to decide where they're competitive. They can ask their guidance counselor. They can go to a data-rich publication like the Princeton Review and easily figure out where they stack up. In contrast, the average medical student has to draw from resources like, the biased Apply Smart graphics, or N=1 testimonials from your classmates, or vague statistics on the websites of the few programs that publish them. Or you can turn to speculation and anecdote from Reddit or Student Doctor Network or Twitter. Or we can turn to faculty advisors who have stale knowledge of the residency application system based on their own experience 15 or 20 years ago. That's what medical students are relying on. What medical students really need is information about, am I likely to get into this program or not? And that information is simply not available. It's worth pausing for a minute and asking why. Why don't we provide better information to applicants? Why is this the system that we have? And I think there's a few reasons for it. One reason is that appearances matter. To be frank, some program directors are hesitant to publish their statistics because they are worried that it will hurt their recruiting. They worry that, quote unquote, top candidates, if they see a low mean USMLE score for that program, that those candidates are going to feel overqualified and they're not even going to apply there. And that would jeopardize the program's ability to recruit better residents and bring their program up a notch. A second reason that I think GME leaders have been reluctant to publish this kind of information is that there would probably be unintended consequences. If programs were required to release standardized information on their entering class, it would certainly be used by others like U.S. News & World Report or Doximity to factor into their residency rankings. It's something that many program directors would not be eager for. And if it were to occur, we can expect that residency programs will have to focus even more than they do already on measurable metrics of prestige like Step 1 scores, school prestige, AOA status, etc. A third consideration is confidentiality. When we're talking about colleges, there's just a much bigger N than there is for residency programs. For example, it's one thing for Yale to report the SAT data for the 1,600 undergraduates that they have coming in as freshmen. That's fine. That stays pretty anonymous. It would probably still be okay for their internal medicine program to list the mean Step 1 score for the 36 residents who come in each year. But what about the 5 incoming dermatology residents, or the 3 plastic surgery residents, or the 2 neurosurgery interns? At a certain point, reporting these statistics is going to compromise confidentiality of the residents. And the last thing is meaning. Even if we gave these statistics out in a standardized way, I don't think they would be that helpful to an individual applicant. Suppose a program listed their mean Step 1 score as being 240. What does that really tell you? It could mean that their residents have scores ranging from 205 to 265. Or it could mean that they screen out every single candidate who has less than 235. Or maybe every single resident who had a Step 1 score that was below their mean had incredible research experience or a good away rotation. In the end, the decisions that lead to a candidate's ultimate ranking are so individualized that even if summary statistics were provided, they probably would not be that informative to students. Take, for example, another product from the AAMC, Residency Explorer. Residency Explorer is a database into which an applicant can place their own information and compare that to the profile of entering residents at various residency programs. Now, it is described as being a working prototype, at least the version that I used on the slide that follows. So it's possible that the AMC will have some features that are a little bit more streamlined than what's up there now. But let's take a look at the kind of information that's available to residency applicants. I put in my own information into Residency Explorer, at least my application information as near as I can remember it over a decade later. And I brought up my own residency program, the program where I'm an associate program director. Residency Explorer takes my profile and compares it to the profile of residents who entered the program. And to preserve anonymity, they use data over a multiple year period from 2014 to 2018. They also don't tell you exactly where your profile would fall. They give you a quartile. So you may find that, for example, certain factors may fall in the upper 25% of residents who enter the program, or in the bottom 25%, or in the middle 50%. And that's all interesting information. But what's missing here is any sense of how the program weights these various areas. If I'm in the top 25% by one metric and the bottom 25% for another, is one of those a deal breaker? Does one of them matter more than the other? All that is kept under the hood and hidden from applicants. And you kind of have to keep that information hidden for the reasons that I mentioned before. So I think this is about as good as Residency Explorer can get in its present configuration. So is there another way? Is there a way to provide residency applicants better information, a different type of information that would help them decide to which programs they should apply? Something that sidesteps the problems that we've seen with Apply Smart, focusing only on the number of applications submitted, which, as we've discussed, ignores the nature of programs and their competitiveness. Is there a kind of information that would be better than what's in Residency Explorer, which includes the profile of residents who actually matched at that program, but who ends up at a program is often so idiosyncratic that it's not useful information that can be reported and maintain anonymity and be useful at the same time? I think there is. I think there's another type of information that we could report to applicants that would get around many of these problems. Unlike the number of applications submitted and the probability of residency entry that is assessed by Apply Smart, the relationship between the number of contiguous ranks submitted and the probability of matching is a very predictable relationship. You can see what I mean here. This graphic is taken from the NRMP's Charting Outcomes in the Match Report. I used anesthesiology just for sake of example. But what you'll see here is that plotted along the x-axis are number of contiguous ranks submitted. Now, according to the NRMP, the number of contiguous ranks are the number of ranked programs that an applicant submits before they rank a different specialty. So if I applied to 12 programs, 10 in anesthesia and 2 in pediatrics, and I ranked all 10 anesthesiology programs first, and then I ranked my backup pediatrics programs as 11 and 12, then I submitted 10 contiguous ranks in anesthesiology. And if I did so, you'd see that by submitting 10 contiguous ranks, I have a very high probability of matching in anesthesiology. In fact, if I just submitted 5 contiguous ranks, I would have a 90% chance of matching in anesthesiology. That's not bad, especially when you remember that the average anesthesiology applicant applies to 34 programs. Or let's take a look at an even more competitive specialty, dermatology. The mean number of applications submitted per applicant last year was 69 applications. But you don't have to rank 69 programs. In fact, if you rank 9 dermatology programs, you also would enjoy a 90% plus match rate. In fact, these curves look similar for every single specialty in the charting outcomes in the match report. For every specialty, if you rank somewhere between 5 and 12 programs, you have a 90% chance of successfully matching. And that's what I'm showing you here is that threshold. For anesthesiology, it's 5. For derm, it's 9. For orthopedic surgery, it's 12. For pathology, it's only 4. Now, all these data are for U.S. seniors, but the NRMP actually makes these reports for osteopathic graduates as well. Here's one for, just for sake of example, OBGYN. Again, we see that steep upslope and then a flattening of the curve, and you hit that 90% threshold right around 10 contiguous ranks for a DO who's applying in OBGYN. Or we can look at international medical graduates who are ranking internal medicine programs. Again, the same shape of the curve, and again, we hit that 90% threshold at about 10 or 12 applications, depending on whether the applicant is a U.S. citizen or a non-U.S. citizen. The bottom line is this, and this is a really important point. Applicants don't need to apply to any certain number of programs. They need to apply to enough programs to have a certain number of programs to rank, and then their likelihood of success in the match is very predictable. The real question is, how do we help applicants figure out where they get these programs to rank? And I have an idea about that. What if we use residency interview data to calculate the probability that a given applicant will receive an interview offer? What I mean is, imagine that you logged into Residency Explorer and you put in your information, but instead of getting that vague profile comparison that I showed you before, what if you got a probability that you would get an interview offer at our program? I mean, that's really the kind of information that candidates want to know, right? Applicants want to know where they'll be offered an interview so that they can apply to enough programs to get enough interviews, to get enough programs to rank, to take advantage of that highly predictable relationship between contiguous ranks and match success that we were looking at on the previous slides. And sure, the number of interviews does not perfectly correlate with the number of contiguous ranks. There are certainly applicants who go and interview at a program and they find the program to be utterly detestable, and they would rather go unmatched than have to work their residency at that program. However, the NRMP's data showed the majority of applicants ranked all the programs at which they interviewed. And even if an applicant chooses to apply to a couple of extra programs where they're likely to get an interview just to hedge against the fact that they'll find a couple of programs to be unrankable, it still would allow an applicant to make a predictable application strategy instead of employing just a total scattershot approach, applying to tons of programs all across the board just in the hopes of getting enough interview offers. And it wouldn't be that hard to calculate these probabilities and give them to applicants. All that it would take is the AAMC getting the list of candidates that a program interviewed. And then you take that data and all the data that's already available in ARIS, which apparently they already have the ability to mine because they're doing it for Residency Explorer. You take all that data and you just let a logistic regression model do its work. You wouldn't even have to involve the program directors in how they choose applicants to interview. You could just let the math do it all. But if you did involve the program directors, you'd probably get much more accurate probability estimates. Because if your program uses a cut score of, say, 220 for USMLE Step 1, then the probability of being offered an interview if you have a 219 is 0%, not what the model spits out. Or conversely, there might be a program who, if you've done an away rotation or if you go to that medical school, you automatically get an interview. Your chance of getting an interview is 100%. And the probability estimate that the model spits out doesn't have to be extremely precise. It would still be informative to applicants to know that at a given program, they have a greater than 90% chance of being offered an interview, or maybe they have a less than 10% chance of being offered an interview. That still would be useful information to an applicant who's trying to figure out how many programs and to which programs they should apply. The point I want to emphasize is that making these kind of models is absolutely technically feasible. And in fact, if the AAMC does not do it with the data that they're sitting on, I will bet you that within the next several years, one of the private players in the market, like Thalamus or Interview Broker, I'll bet you that they will. Beyond being technically feasible, this kind of approach would also preserve resident anonymity, because we're not focused on the residents who matched to the program. We're focused on the much bigger pool of people who were offered an interview at that program. And not everyone who's offered an interview will choose to attend an interview, and not everyone who attends an interview will end up matching at that program. Even a very selective program with a very high yield is still going to rank many applicants more than the number of spots that they're trying to fill. It would not be unusual in the least for a program to rank 4, 8, 10 times as many programs as the spots they're trying to fill. So you have a much bigger pool of data that you can use for the model building and probability estimates. Having these probabilities would benefit applicants because it would allow them to make a rational application strategy, kind of like what we were talking about before with college applications. For the average applicant applying in an average specialty, I'm talking about someone who's just square in the middle of the bell curve, what they're going to find is that there are some programs that are a reach, where they have a low probability of being offered an interview, and some programs where they have a very high probability. Now, some candidates, when faced with that information, they will so greatly value the possibility of being able to go to a prestigious residency program that it will spur them to apply to even more programs because their probability is low at those prestigious programs. And I'm okay with that. It's America. You're allowed to spend money on what you want to spend money on. If that's what you want to do, then have at it. But I'll be honest, I think there's probably a lot of applicants who will not be motivated to do that. They're not going to apply to 100 programs when they see that many programs where they'd be happy going, they have a high likelihood of being offered an interview. They'll cobble together a list of places like that, and they'll be happy and they'll have a fine career, and everyone will be better off for it. On the other hand, you may have someone who's more of a borderline applicant, and they may see that across the board, they have a low probability of getting an interview offer. And that person may be spurred to apply widely, and you know what? That's a good thing for them. They still have benefited from receiving this information. But you'll also have some applicants who are very high-powered, very likely to be successful applicants. And I think that this will be beneficial to them too, because instead of out of fear applying to a ton of programs, they can more taper their list when they see that they have a very high likelihood of success. And you know what? This benefits everyone too, because one of the most wasteful forms of application inflation is when very highly talented and very well qualified applicants over apply, because then they get over invited to interviews and they end up holding interview offers that they don't attend or can't attend, and it ends up gumming up the system for everybody else. So I think that this information across the board is going to be beneficial to applicants. And you know what? Reporting these probabilities will be beneficial to program directors too, because it will result in them getting fewer applications from the kind of applicant that they don't really have much interest in interviewing. And they can spend more time focused on the applications that are really the people that they're interested in. A program director honestly would have an incentive to participate in creating a good model, because if you're not going to interview students who failed step 1, or if you're not going to interview non-US citizens or any other particular group, then just go ahead and make that clear. Make it clear to those people that their likelihood of getting an interview is 0%. Let them save their money and let you save your time. Everybody benefits. Now, when I say everyone benefits, I don't necessarily mean that this is going to solve application fever. In fact, I'm on record as saying the only thing that's going to fix that is application caps. But I still think this is the right thing to do. Give applicants the information that they need. Let them do with it what they will. That's the right thing to do. I'm okay with that. What I'm not okay with is students being financially plundered and program directors getting buried so deep in applications that the only way to evaluate their future colleagues is with convenience metrics like Step 1 scores, all while we all just sit around and act like there's nothing we could do to make the system better. It benefits no one. Well, no one other than the AAMC's accountants and executives, when you have students who are submitting 10 times as many applications as they need to in order to match. Or when you have students who are submitting applications to programs where their application isn't even going to be read. But listen, we are not stuck with the low-value information that we use today. If you want to cool off application fever, it's not going to work to ask students to apply smart. We have to give students the information that they need in order to apply smarter. And with that, I'll bring this podcast to a close. Most of what I talked about today is already written up on my website, thesheriffofsodium.com. So if you liked what you heard, trust me, there's more where that came from if you just go to the website. Or if you're on Twitter, please follow me. I'm at JB JBCarmody. Thanks for listening, and thanks even more for spending a few minutes in critical thought about these issues.